Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all. I'm Steve Orlins, the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and am pleased to welcome audiences from 78 partner organizations in the United States and 4 partners in China, as well as individuals from around the world to the National Committee's 14th annual China Town Hall. Today's program comes at a critical time in U.S.-China relations. With the election of a new president, both countries have the ability to improve the relationship for the benefit of both peoples. Sino-American relations has a profound impact on communities across our country, so we hope that the issues raised during our program today will spark an educated and lively discussion at your local town hall conversations. In view of the importance of these issues to the future of America, the National Committee has adapted the format of China Town Hall this year, expanding from a single night into a multi-night series of programming to address the range of issues confronting the relationship. After tonight's keynote, we will host subsequent evenings on economics and trade, climate and health, and society and culture. In addition, a 5th Mandarin language event will be held for our Chinese-speaking audiences in the United States, China, and around the world. We hope you can join us for those nights as well. Information can be found on our website at ncuscr.org/CTH. As the president-elect formulates policies towards China and the rest of the world, we need to have a full and frank discussion of where American interests lie. So we are thrilled to welcome Ray Dalio as keynote speaker at China Town Hall. Ray is the founder, co-chief investment officer, and co-chairman of Bridgewater Associates, the largest hedge fund in the world. He's the author of New York Times bestseller, Principles, Life and Work, and the upcoming The Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail, which I just had the pleasure of completing and is a must-read and will be released this winter. With over 35 years of business, personal, and philanthropic engagement with China, he offers special insights into China and U.S.-China relations. I'd like to thank our partners at all 82 venues across the United States and China who have transitioned seamlessly in this virtual world to bring this year's China Town Hall conversation to their local communities. Let me thank our speakers, a veritable who's who of U.S.-China relations. We also want to thank the Henry Luce Foundation for their support in funding China Town Hall. Finally, let me thank our dedicated staff at the National Committee for putting this program together. Thanks to all who have submitted questions in advance, and throughout the webcast, we encourage you to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag CTH2020 and tagging @NCUSCR. Without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ray Dalio for his keynote remarks. Ray?
Well, thank you, Steve, for inviting me to share my thoughts with you and others during this most remarkable time for China, for the United States, and for our relationship. Before describing what this time looks like to me, I would like to share with you a bit of my background, which affects my biases, maybe. My perspective is influenced by being a global macro investor for over 50 years and in having a lot of contact with Chinese economy, its markets, and its senior policymakers who are responsible for the economy and the markets. In my job, I've followed all major economies over those 50 years, looking at the big drivers of their economic performances to bet on how well these countries and their markets would do. In 1984, I was first invited to China by CITIC, which was the only window company at the time. I mean, basically that meant that it was closed to the rest of the world, and CITIC, which was formed by a capitalist, first capitalist, Deng Xiaoping appointed him, was allowed to look at the outside world and learn from it. And so I was invited to teach them about the financial markets. That began the relationship. 5 years later, in 1989, my friends at CITIC introduced me to 7 young, great people who were called the Securities Exchange Executive Council, which was a group of 7 people, which was put together for the purpose of making the first stock market in China since after liberation. And there was no money then, really, and they were in a dingy hotel, and these great people made the first stock market. And my relations continued, and along the way, I had contact with all sorts of people, including very common people, because my son went to an all-Chinese school there when he was 11, and eventually formed and ran a foundation for 12 years that helped special needs orphans in China. And that brought me to all sorts of China and all sorts of people in China. And that affected my perspective of China. In the 36 years since I first went to China, I've seen China's per capita incomes increase by 25 times, life expectancy increased by an average of 10 years, and the average number of years of education increased by about 80%. I saw capitalism develop and flourish, and the capital markets develop and open up. I saw how the Chinese stock and bond markets became the second largest in the world. I saw how close these things, I saw up close how these things happen. I also saw how China became much more welcoming to foreign investors. For example, while in 2015, only 1% of the markets in China were accessible to foreign investors, now over 60% are available to them. Because investing is a matter of finding relative attractiveness, I make comparisons, and comparisons are important. And simultaneously with my watching China evolve, I watched the United States evolve in ways that concern me. For example, the creating of a lot of debt and the printing of a lot of money, which in history was a threat to reserve currencies. And that prompted me to study the rises and declines of reserve currency empires over the last 500 years. The chart I'm showing you here goes back 500 years, and it shows the major empires during that time. This is an aggregate measure of power made up of 8 other measures I'll explain in a second. But the blue line is the US and the red line is China. I think it pretty much speaks for itself in terms of that progression of Chinese power in many ways. That power index is made up of 8 gauges of powers, which have been shown to be the most important. These are the powers of education, innovation and technology, competitiveness in world markets, share of world trade, economic output, military, and the strength of the financial sector and the reserve currency. This next slide shows each of these power indices for the United States and China. They pretty much speak for themselves. I won't take you through them. We don't have time, but you get the idea. But I would like to draw your attention to the 2 that are lagging the other measures of power in China. They are the power of the reserve currency and the power of the financial markets and the financial sector. These powers traditionally lag other powers, but inevitably catch up. In studying history, I saw that all leading trading empires over the last 500 years had the world's reserve currency and the world's financial centers. During the 1600s and the 1700s, the Dutch guilder became the world's reserve currency, and Amsterdam became the world's financial center after what we now call Holland became the world's largest trading country. In the 1700s and the 1800s, the British pound became the world's reserve currency, and London became the world's financial center. And after the British Empire became the world's largest trading country. And in the 20th century, up until now, the United States dollar became the world's reserve currency, and New York became the world's financial center after the US became the world's largest trading country. China is now the world's largest trading country. I believe China is now evolving into that role. Even though China's shares of world trade and world GDP are comparable to the United States' share, the renminbi is less than 2% of global reserves, world trade invoicing, and cross-border lending. In contrast, the US dollar accounts for over 50% of global reserves and trade invoicing, and is around 60% of cross-border lending. I expect that to change as China moves to internationalize the renminbi and open up its capital account. China's capital markets are opening up to foreigners and non-Chinese investors who are underweighted in that. For example, though China accounts for now roughly 15% of world equity markets capitalization, it counts only for a couple of percent of global investors' portfolios. So I believe that this is a very special moment because simultaneously there will be the confluence of the rapid development of the Chinese capital markets, the opening up of these markets to foreign investors, the relative attractiveness of them, and the underweightedness of global investors in them. And this is happening when the fundamentals are undermining the US dollars. I believe that these developments are likely to lead to capital and knowledge inflows into China, and that will benefit the Chinese capital markets and more broadly benefit foreign investors and Chinese investors too. Because of how I see things and the contact there, I've been a chronic bull on China. People have accused me of being biased, naive, and in some cases unpatriotic. I think I'm just being objective. Maybe I'm missing some important things that this extremely well-informed audience can help me see. So I'm looking forward to our conversation, Steve.
That is a fabulous introduction and basically a statement about why your book is a must-read, because it really goes into a lot of those concepts in great detail. So it's fair to summarize to say that you're looking at America in relative decline versus China, and China at relative ascent. Is there something that the United States can or should do to kind of prevent that relative decline?
Well, it all comes back to those 8 basics, but let's put it into basics. You have all individuals, companies, and governments at the end of the day have to earn more than they spend, and they have to have a solid balance sheet of assets which are greater than liabilities. And you could see reverberate through the economy with this shock. Those who have those things are in good shape, and those who don't are in bad shape. That's true whether or not you print your currency or not. So what that means is you have to have either be able to be more productive, because we're running deficits in these regards. Now we're funding with debt, which we're printing. Or so you have to raise your incomes, or you have to cut your expenditures. We're lucky to have the exorbitant privilege of the reserve currency, which allows us to do that, but we're testing the limits of that. The other things that successful empires have done over there is they have excellent broad education, and not education just in terms of subject matter, but the teaching of civility, of how people should be with each other. And by and large, they work in ways that can be competitive and inventive, but they're rowing in the same direction. And they're, as a result of that, pursuing the same missions, and they have a common dream. You know, we called it the American dream, let's say. I think we need an American dream, a dream of what are we going after that we can agree. I thought it was equal opportunity. I would believe in equal opportunity might be a good thing. But anyway, you have to have a common dream. You have to have metrics behind that common dream. And then you have to be pursuing it together. Those through history have been, the most key elements of countries' successes.
The reserve currency question. You have 50% of reserves held in dollars, 2% held in renminbi. It's much more than global trade. It's confidence in the currency. Since the renminbi is not truly convertible, what's going to happen in the future that's going to convince those that are holding reserves to be holding RMB?
Well, traditionally, you could see that there's the development of the RMB. By the way, I think it'll evolve over decades, but I think it'll evolve pretty quickly. There is the loss of confidence in the reserve currency, which drives people to see alternative storeholds of wealth. So, for example, when there's a debt issue, there are two ways of dealing with debt. There's hard money, traditionally backed by gold. And when that happened, then there was breakdowns in that monetary system, the valuation. So for example, classically, March 1933, Roosevelt, with the debt problem, was forced to go off the gold standard, printed a lot of money, devalued the dollar, and then it moved on. In 1971, we had the same. Nixon did the same thing, went off the gold standard, and devalued and so on. And the creation of a lot of debt and money means that money goes someplace else, and it traditionally, both of those cases, it went into stocks, gold, and other places. So money is always the holders of money, which are the holders of bonds. Bonds are a promise to receive money, a lot of money over a period of time. It's a very long money position. And when those become unattractive, such as now, let's say, you get zero interest rate or close to zero interest rate or even a negative interest rate, and there's a lot of creation of debt and a lot of printing of money, that drives that into other assets. They may not be another currency if there's not a good currency. They may be stocks, they may be gold, and they may be another currency. But it is that kind of time that we're in. So next year and the year after, no matter what, we're going to have large deficits. We are going to produce a lot of debt, and we will monetize that debt, and that debt will have a negative real return, and therefore people will borrow in it, will find it more advantageous to borrow in it than own it, and then they will move to other assets. So that is one ingredient that's happening now, at the same time as another number of ingredients, the opening up of the
Don't we need convertibility? Don't we need convertibility in RMB?
No, you don't need capital flows. You don't need total convertibility.
How can you have confidence if you're sitting in a central bank in Japan or the EU or anywhere else if it's not ultimately convertible? You have an obligation to your people.
Oh, no. The convertibility, it depends on the nature of the convertibility, right? The capital account, by the way, is going to be opened. You're seeing now an opening up of the capital account. You will see. And you also see more internationalization of the renminbi. But today, I'm an investor in Chinese capital markets. For the last couple of years, it's been, and I can safely bring my money in and out. And I have to, in making those decisions, decide what the relative risks are of one type of risk versus another type of risk. Any country, including the United States, can establish capital controls. And there's a risk that countries take.
China does have capital controls. One is theoretical, one is actual.
But the degree of capital controls, as an investor who brings international money in and out of there, some onshore, some linked because of the links that they've created in Hong Kong for Hong Kong markets and so on. I can get in various ways those types of exposures, both onshore and offshore, in a way that allows me to put my money in and take my money out. I can do that. So it's not an impediment. As a professional investor who's doing this, I can guarantee you it's not an impediment. And so in making those choices, now I recognize that at any time that could be closed and you might have issues and so on, just like I recognize, it's a risk here, but one has to weigh those risks, because in weighing those risks, to be absent the Chinese capital markets is very risky, because if you're looking at this almost as being, think of it just as diversification. There's the United States and there's China, and basically those are the two big economies. If you're dealing with industries of the future, technology, and so on, to be heavily weighted, entirely weighted almost, in the countries that are the older, the reserve currency countries, the United States, Europe, and Japan, and you look at those older, more indebted countries that are having problems with monetary policy because they have to produce a lot of debt and produce a lot of money to do that. And to not be in China is, to me, in my opinion, risky. So I feel that I have to have a diversification, and I compare those risks. So none of the risks are zero. It's just a matter of assessing that. And I can tell you that market, that foreign investors are moving in, and the Chinese are doing things to build confidence. They can undermine it, but I think that the diversification benefits outweigh the risks.
Did the delay of the Ant IPO affect that whole concept?
No, it's such a good example that Westerners, I think, are like on their edges of the seats, and they pay so much attention to the one development. We're almost like news-hungry people. What's today's development? And they don't pay attention to the evolution. I've had a lot of dealings with Chinese financial regulators. And I could say that generally speaking, no, not generally speaking, almost always speaking, I found them to be reasonable, caring, and highly informed people who are now in an environment which is changing at an extremely fast pace. And that there's a risk of being too loose or too tight, particularly on new types of investment. The Ant is a whole new concept, innovative concept, in terms of banking, and almost could replace or threaten the banking system in China. And it hasn't yet been properly established in terms of regulatory review and the like. And so that's an element. And of course, it's important to be clear that what we have in China is state capitalism. So state is going to control those things. But I've watched in the United States, in terms of regulatory authorities, struggle to try to get the balance between freedom of what is being done and restrictions on what is being done right. We had the financial crisis in the United States because they were too liberal in terms of controlling some of the things that were being done. There's always a wrestling match on that. And then I think Ant got ahead of that. It's up to one to interpret that. But anyway, it's the regulatory authorities to decide that. And then, so I think it was progressing too fast. And it had to be clear as to who the authority was.
At one point in my life, I was an investment banker who did IPOs. If 3 days before an IPO, the deal was pulled, wow, that probably would have been the end of my career at that point. That's you were not in good contact with the regulators if that happened.
China is not the same. We can't judge China by the same exact standards in the same ways. And I think that people could make the mistake of mistaking imperfections for the changes in the directions. As I'm saying, if you look at the directions and you look at what's going on, those are the trends and those are the forces about the big things that I think that are going on.
I mean, one could make a strong argument that if you compare the language of the third plenum of the 18th Party Congress, which was in 2013, to the 2 weeks ago, the fifth plenum of the 19th Party Congress, with respect to state participation in the economy, it's really quite starkly different. And a lot of the Chinese miracle that you have witnessed in your 36 years, and I've witnessed in my 41 years in China, is based upon the private sector. And is the miracle going to continue if the state is playing such a major role?
I think it's important to understand, to know the people and to understand the intentions and then interpret the actions in light of those particular intentions. I think a lot of foreigners may misunderstand that the very strong reform policies that we've seen pervasively at an extremely fast pace are also happening at a time when there's not going to be total or unleashed state-owned enterprises because there's certain benefits. So I see they're wrestling with the question of what should be a state-owned enterprise and what shouldn't be a state-owned enterprise. Is that a strategic enterprise? Should that be a public-private partnership? Should it bring in equity? And so the desire to corporatize or privatize or whatever a lot of state-owned enterprises, and at the same time to keep them also, many of them, controlled. Let's remember that this is a socialist capitalist economy, and that when matters of employment are entered into there and direction, everything is not a free market society. In the United States, it's almost entirely a free market. That has good and bad things. Sometimes it's difficult to get resources to where the resources should go. Sometimes in education, whatever, in building infrastructure, building roads is a challenge in the United States. There are pros and cons. But in this state capitalist type of system, there will be those types of controls and directions. I think it would be a mistake to say that the privatization, let's call it, of state-owned enterprises in China is not happening the way we capitalists would like, to mistake that to being that China is not producing capitalist type of things like the development of capital markets, the increase in efficiencies. I mean, we could just look at the results. You know, we could look at how the COVID was handled, how their economy is handled, and so on. If we're so hung up on getting it exactly that way, then we might miss the bigger things that are going on.
Well, I would argue that the returns on state-owned capital versus private capital are much, much lower, and ultimately they will have to pay a price for that.
But that's up to investors. Have the beauty of being able to decide whether they want to go into or not want to go into those enterprises. But you must agree that there's a plethora of wonderful companies that this year will probably have something like 40% of the IPOs be China in the world, big IPOs, be Chinese companies on Chinese markets. Anyway, a lot of them will be Chinese companies on Chinese markets. And we as investors have to decide whether we want to go to those companies and those markets or not. And so there's a lot there to offer, while you might choose to stay clear of the state-owned enterprises, if you like.
Okay, well, let's go to our first audience question from Jasmine Fan at BlackRock.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Fan from New York. And my question is, how do you think American investment companies should position themselves in the world of US-China decoupling, but also to consider opportunities in the gradual opening of China's financial market? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think the world is changing in very profound ways. And I think that sometimes when we look at it up close, we can miss the big pictures of change. And that it is changing where China is really gaining its stride. And anyway, it will be a competitive power. So I think that investors and investment managers have a responsibility to know China well, be there, and make investments there as they must. I'm a global macro investor, so I have to be in all the major markets and assess those. And I think that diversification and being there and being aware so that you have an intimacy of understanding of what's going on in China and make those choices from that intimate, up-close perspective, I think is required.
If you're roughly at 3% now, and you're saying a neutral weighting would be 15%, how long do you think it'll take for international investors to move to that weighting? How many years?
Well, by the way, that 15% is also growing at a fast pace. So I expect the 15% will grow, and I expect that the 15%, so the 15% will grow and the share of that will grow. I would expect, I can't tell you, how fast, but I would say maybe, something in the vicinity of a 30 to 50% growth rate, and that probably more.
Annual.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is central bank digital currency going to play a role in this now that it's begun to be rolled out in China?
Let me explain digital currencies for a second globally. There are two purposes of an exchange rate and of a currency, and that is as a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth. So there's the digitalizing of the clearing system. No central bank, I believe, is going to allow an alternative currency to gain strength, such as a Bitcoin type of currency and so on. The power of having your own currency and being able to print your own money is an enormous power, and I don't think that you will see anything like that. But the digitalization is not only efficient from a transaction point of view, it helps to minimize the risks of the existing clearing system, which is fairly heavily influenced by the United States. Some of our sanctions, a lot of our sanctions, as you might understand, which probably sanctions are our greatest power, the United States' greatest power, happen by influencing through sanctions, currency movements through the SWIFT clearing system and the like. Digitalization helps to reduce those risks. So that's what's going on with digitalization, and I expect that it'll be successful.
Even though Ali and Tencent already had what was in effect digital payment systems? Again, was this a question of the state participating where the private sector was already in it?
This is the government digitalizing the currency, offering a digitalized version of the currency.
Let's go to the next video question from Corey Cooper, Columbia Law School, Black Voices on Greater China.
Hello, my name is Corey Cooper. I'll be attending the China Townhall Keynote program with Ray Dalio online. My question has to do with the future of U.S.-China business relations. General Secretary Xi Jinping recently gave a foreign business-friendly speech at the 3rd China International Import Expo. However, given President Trump's propensity for blaming China when questioned about the U.S. economy and the desire of some officials in his administration to demonstrate their, quote, tough on China, I wonder what your thoughts are on how likely it is that business relations could actually deteriorate rather than improve further between now and January 20th, when Trump officially leaves office. Thank you.
Well, there's the question of the conflicts, and then there's the date. Both are embedded in that question, I think. There are 5 types of conflicts that exist with the rising power challenging an existing power. They are, and we call them wars. There's a trade war. There's a technology war. There is a geopolitical war. There is a capital war. And then there is a military, let's call it competition, that could conceivably be into a military war. They're all connected, and and because of the threats of those, we are having decoupling taking place, and which means the building of sort of self-sufficiency. And so that is going to be with us for a long time, and how those conflicts are handled will matter a lot. As far as the Trump moves between now and the end of the year regarding any actions with China, I wouldn't expect, my own guess is that there wouldn't be any big developments that would be traumatic or surprising in either side. But, I'm not the geopolitical expert who should be offering those comments as well as other people here. But by speaking to many of those, I would say I wouldn't expect between now and January 20th a significant developments in Chinese-American relations pertaining to the things you're asking about.
We have to hope not. So there were additional sanctions put on people in Hong Kong last night by Secretary Pompeo. Let's go, you mentioned technology. Let's go to a question on technology from Nick Young in San Francisco.
Hi, everyone. This is Nick Young in San Francisco. As the US-China tech war intensifies, both countries are pursuing separate models of global cyber governance with distinct values and ecosystems. China may have initiated this process when it blocked Facebook, Twitter, and Google more than a decade ago, but now the United States has retaliated by issuing executive orders banning TikTok and WeChat. With no positive turn in sight, what would a technology decoupling look like, and what would be the consequences?
The technology decoupling, of course, there's so many technologies and so many applications, but let's say at the big picture level, it certainly reduces the pace of development, and it puts entities who are trying to juggle both, sort of on edge. It means, in my opinion, it sets back development, particularly in the United States in some ways. In China, let's deal with that privacy issue. It is technologically a fact that the more data you have, and the more artificial intelligence is applied to that data, the better you can understand and manage things. So from a competitive point of view, I think it's a desirable thing to have the kind of massive collection of data. I've heard just different numbers, 8 times as much data per person and so on. And of course, the other side of that is the privacy side. Each person comes down where they want, what is the benefit of that privacy. In China, most people view that as something, that absence of privacy is something that brings about better security and a more civil society. In the United States, we value personal privacy issues. I'm not going to get into that, but from an efficiency point of view, it's contrary to efficiency when those technologies are decoupled. And it also is somewhat of a disadvantage technologically to have more holding of data private than to use it in a broader way.
Raises the question of reciprocity, though, that Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter have been blocked in China for a number of years now, and WeChat and TikTok and other Chinese social media apps are able to operate in the United States. How do we resolve that question? In other words, there's a sense, and I heard this a lot from the Trump administration. I oppose the WeChat and TikTok bans in the United States. However, the response from the Trump administration is it's not fair because we can't operate similarly in China.
I think everybody has to look at what the bigger picture. What are the most important things in each country that'll be lines that won't be able to be compromised, and they're different things in different countries. So you're not going to get equal approaches, or for example, the privacy issue and Google and so on developing in China has to do with how information is managed in China, that is managed in a way that's different from how it's managed in the United States. And so reciprocity is not going to be something that you can develop policies on. We're going to have the same reciprocity. You can use them as negotiating. So I think you have to look at what are the most important things in China, and there's a certain government approach that doesn't have that same free flow of information, particularly foreigners. However, there's an economic component of it too. Some countries are more protectionist in some ways than other countries. So those are matters of negotiation, but they can't be approached like that we can demand reciprocity with matters that are not equal. For example, the big issue for the Biden administration is the human rights issue. That issue is going to be then dealt with the sovereignty question in China. China would view a human rights question as a sovereignty question. Should countries operating outside some of this jurisdiction assess and judge and exert pressure on how they should deal with domestic affairs and so on. So how will that work out? There'll probably be a whole lot of arguing about that. And then it'll come down to, who has what power. At the end of the day, this whole thing's going to come down to who has what power. And that's why I think in the United States, the most important thing is focusing on how we can get stronger. But anyway, those issues won't be resolved by expecting, we do it and then they'll do it too.
See, the problem we have, because we're dealing, obviously I'm dealing with the Congress, dealing hopefully with the new Biden administration, is when there are violations of what are universal values. This isn't a question, that it becomes extremely difficult to persuade the Congress, the American people, that we should even be dealing with them on a lot of these issues. So when you talk about reciprocity, people just go, well, it's just not fair. It's just not fair. We shouldn't be allowing that. And the argument the Chinese make with respect to Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, actually doesn't hold water. It's exactly what you said in the second part. It's protectionist. It's economic protectionism. It's not truly national security. And if China is not willing to enter into discussions on these kinds of issues, it's going to be really tough to get to a constructive relationship.
Well, I think the problem is that different people have different views about what is fair. And in the reality of world affairs is that those interpretations don't matter really much in international relations, maybe unfortunately, but maybe fortunately, because if different people have different views of what's fair, maybe you can't get there. And the only thing that really matters are relative strengths, relative powers, because it's a negotiating thing. And so, you know, it's very interesting in the history. The United States, really starting under Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, was the first country in history to view that the relationships between countries should be analogous to the relationships that we want to have between people within countries. In other words, he viewed that the United States as a democracy and that the way people should be with each other should be a model for world governance. And that's why he formed the League of Nations, and the League of Nations failed, and the United Nations failed and after it. So there's not a world organization, there's not a world court to adjudicate differences. So for example, if you say that, you know, the world wants, let's say that human rights issue and so on, I would suppose if the world signed an agreement and agreed by and had enforceability so that they were that, then you could bring them to the world court and resolve that. Let's say on the issue of WTO, China brought issues of WTO to the WTO, and certain things were decided in its favor, certain things are decided against it, but the WTO.
Hello, no one can hear you.
All right, folks, Lyle Goldstein here. I guess I'm the speaker.
Benson, and I'll be attending China Town Hall in Middlebury, Vermont this year. And my question is, what do you see as the most important area for the US and China to collaborate on science and research? And how can these two superpowers learn from COVID-19 and work together to prevent the next pandemic?
Well, I think that's a great question, and there's tremendous opportunity for cooperation. And, you know, it almost goes back to ping pong diplomacy, but the idea of dealing with climate change, that's a common interest. not only this pandemic, but global health issues. Just the reestablishing communications and looking for areas of cooperation, I think would go a long way to improving the psychology and demonstrating the win-win potential of those relationships.
Let's go on to society and culture. The committee's been doing a lot of programming on kind of anti-Asian bias in the United States, and you've written extensively about a persistent anti-China bias. Many of these such subtle prejudices have come out in the open in the past year. How pernicious do you think this threat is, and how do you become more empathetic with our cultural differences and yet hold firm to our values?
Again, I'm like a mechanic, I don't have an ideology pertaining to this, I'm just a mechanic. Anger traditionally comes, racism, demonization, across classes, comes during periods of economic distress. And so we see it here in the United States. Number of statistics that could show is that the majority of Republicans and the majority of Democrats actually hate the other side. And so whether that's rich, poor, racial, geographic, all of those prejudices sort of come out, particularly then if you have an opponent. The idea of demonizing the other side in pursuit of good versus evil is the way that normally happens. So we're seeing that happen. Now, what does that mean? I mean, I don't think it's a good thing. I think it's, understanding, having contact with each other. It does a world of good in all of those cases for, the communications, understanding. It helps people understand each other. But I don't think what can be done. I think whatever propaganda or views are largely going to be extended by the leadership and the media. It's quite often the case that when a country has problems, they try to bring it together by finding an enemy on the outside. It would go a long way if President Biden said something nice about China and the Chinese, or the potential of working together. And it would be very nice if President Xi reciprocated and they took some actions along those lines. And then there would be, hopefully a change in the mean in terms of those kinds of things. But it's a symptom of our times, I think.
Yeah, I fully expect the Biden administration to take action against anti-Asian bias, that they will make statements, they'll revise visa policies that relate to really ethnicity, they'll end the Muslim ban, they'll revise visa policy towards Chinese students, they'll revise H-1B policies. I expect that they will do that because they've really, I think the Asian American community came out strongly for President-elect Biden.
At the same time, I expect that'll be the case, and I hope so. At the same time, these deep-seated prejudices about even the scenarios that are underway are, there's a percentage of a population, a large percentage, that nurtures those.
Yeah, and I think we need to, transparency and light is a great disinfectant. And we need to make sure that, that does not shape the formulation of American policy.
The challenge, though, on that is also the media. The media, when put together with politics, You know, it's nice for us to say, but it's difficult to get that kind of light shown on.
I think the media is actually pretty good in this respect. You know, we've seen the media, you know, a Chinese American correspondent working for CBS pulled out in a White House press conference in what to me was one of the more shocking events over the last 4 years. Let's go to a question from Blake Moss in Kentucky.
My name is Blake Moss and I'm from Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. My question is, why should people from small towns in Kentucky and other places across the South even care about U.S.-China relations? How does it affect them in their daily lives? Thank you for taking my question.
It affects you certainly economically. A lot of the goods that you buy at relatively low prices have been produced in China, and so that affects you in that way economically. And of course, their competition has affected jobs, certain types of jobs that have moved to China and that have left the United States. And so that has an effect on you. And then, of course, what happens to our money, the value of our money, its purchasing power, is affected by what happens in the United States and what happens in China. And then, of course, then there's this great geopolitical struggle, which might or might not affect you, depending on, you know, what transpires. You know, hopefully that won't affect you, and so you'll hear about all the struggles in the South China Seas and so on, and maybe that won't matter. But the technologies you use, the cost of the goods that you have to buy, the jobs and so on, are affected by a lot by Chinese-American relations.
Is it fair to conclude, Ray, that you think the greatest enemy of America is itself and the greatest enemy of China is itself?
Yes.
And if so, kind of give us a sense of why and what that means for policies.
Well, because all of this is a natural extension of strength and well-being. And so those 8 measures that I mentioned before are the fundamental underpinnings of strength, you know, the quality and extensiveness of education, the civility of the people, then the development of resource allocation systems, such as our capital markets allocation system, our ability to produce things at competitive rates, our ability to then earn more than we spend, these kinds, and the development of a military that keeps you strong and protects you, all of those things, those fundamental strengths through all history, through all time, have been most important in determining the well-being of countries. And so we rise and decline based on those. So, for example, if we threaten the reserve currency status, let's say, nowadays we're going to have to produce a lot of debt. I go through the calculations. Who will buy that debt? Americans don't have enough capacity to buy that debt, all that debt. They have to sell it to others outside the world, Those others already own too much of it, and they're a little bit worried about what the return on that's going to be. Americans, even on bonds, the pension funds, endowments, don't think that bonds are going to give them the returns that they need in order to be successful. If you don't buy the bonds and so on, then you're going to have to not buy more than you can afford to buy and all of that. So these basic fundamental underpinnings are what makes a place strong, competitive in the world, make a currency strong and competitive in the world to encounter others in the world. That's just basic.
We're out of time, so let me just close with a question which Chinese media and American media ask me all the time, which is, Are you pessimistic or optimistic about the future of U.S.-China relations?
I'm more optimistic than pessimistic. It won't come the exact way that I would want it to come. And I guess it depends, on how long it'll be. But I think if both countries are allowed to evolve, albeit with the risks, then it'll be fine. The Thucydides trap example is a good example. In the last 500 years, there were 16 times where rising power challenged an existing power. In 12 of those times, they had military wars. That would be a disaster. And in 4 of those times, they didn't. If we can look at those times that they didn't and the need for overwhelming and recognize and remember history, remember how terrible those are and how good win-win relationships are, and we can evolve without those kinds of things, which I think is most likely, it's the most sensible thing to do, then we will both evolve, and we'll evolve together, probably with arguments, but it'll be okay. That is an optimistic scenario for me.
And I very much hope the Biden administration hears that and we can work towards achieving the optimistic scenario. My answer is always, it depends on what the Chinese government does. It depends on what the U.S. government does. And it depends on the people-to-people relationships that are so strong and hopefully will get stronger. Thank you, Ray, for such a wonderful, thoughtful, thought-provoking conversation. And thank you all in the audience for participating in the first night of the National Committee's 2020 China Town Hall Series. We hope you will also join us for the rest of our China Town Hall programming, with our next program coming up on Thursday. More information, including program registration, can be found on our website at ncuscr.org/CTH. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful day.
All right, my name is Yawei Liu. I'm the senior advisor on China at the Carter Center. First of all, I want to apologize for a mistake we made, that we have a Zoom account that can accommodate up to 500 people. That's only for the webinar function. So we use the meeting format, which can only accommodate 100 people. So for those that that some of your friends are not able to come into this room, they can always go to watch it on YouTube. Maybe Summer or Wendy, you can post that YouTube link for those that are here. For those that are in China, we will post a link of the Zoom recording after this session is over. So for today's local town hall, it's sponsored by the China Research Center, which is affiliated with the Ivan Island College of Liberal Arts of Georgia Institute of Technology. The other sponsor is the Emory International Relations Association, which is a student organization at Emory University whose mission is to get Emory community people to be more aware of international affairs. It organizes activities, inviting guest speakers, does fundraising, but one most important thing the association does is to be involved. Model UN. They're hosting Model UN for college students as well as high school students. And finally, the third sponsor of this event is the Carter Center, whose founder, almost 42 years ago, worked with Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, and jointly they made the courageous decision to normalize relationship between the US and China. That relationship now is being threatened. And that's why we have one of the distinguished scholar of the bilateral relationship, in the US to offer a presentation. So I would like Wendy Aviles to introduce our speaker. Wendy?
Thank you, Professor Leo. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am Wendy Aviles, and I'm honored to be introducing Dr. Lau Jared Goldstein, who will offer the keynote presentation entitled Meeting China Halfway, How to Avert War and Reduce Militarized Rivalry in U.S.-China Relations. Dr. Goldstein is a research professor in the China Maritime Studies Institute, CMSI, at the Naval War College. He's also the founding director of the CMSI and author of dozens of articles on Chinese security policy, focusing on Chinese undersea warfare. On the broader subject of the U.S.-China relations, Goldstein published the book Meeting China Halfway in 2015. Over the last several years, Goldstein has focused on the North Korea crisis, and finally, Goldstein speaks Russian as well as Chinese, and is an affiliate of Naval War College's New Russia Maritime Studies Institute. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lau Goldstein.
Professor Goldstein, the floor is yours. Would you like to share your screen? And for our audience, if you have questions, post them to the chat. Once Professor Goldstein finishes the presentation, we'll open the floor for Q&A.
Oops. Sorry. Hi there, everyone. Good evening. I'm very excited to be joining you. That's a tough act to follow. Let's see. But I think you can see my slides now, and I'm really thrilled to be here. As you can see, I'm a huge admirer of President Carter and all he's done as president, and afterwards, his achievements in U.S.-China relations, let alone the rest of the world, are incredible. And I have had the honor to visit the Carter Center before and lecture, and I'm honored to do so again. This is a pivotal time in the relationship. I think that is frequently said, but you know, I come to you tonight with, and I don't want to give anybody nightmares, but I'm very concerned about this relationship, and this title that I put on tonight. Really, I hesitated to write even such a title, but I think it has now come to that where we have to be very clear-eyed about the possibility of war. Ray Dalio just mentioned the Thucydides trap, and I am indeed preoccupied with, this is what keeps me up at night, the possibility that somehow our two great nations could slide into war. So I'll address that issue. It seems to me, I mean, the good news here is that I think if we take certain steps that this can be avoided. As Mr. Dalio said, there are several cases where rising power did not get into war with the hegemonic power. So the question is how to do that. And this is why I'm so glad to share some ideas with you. I noticed, by the way, we have many heavy hitters in the audience tonight. So I'm really, you know, and friends as well. And I'm really looking forward to dialogue. So I'll try to run through these slides very quickly so we might share some ideas, and eager to hear your ideas on this. So for those of you who don't know me, I am mostly a China specialist. I do some, you can see there, here I am with Matteo Ricci, the original, as the father of all China sinologists. But I also do work on Russia too. So this gives me kind of maybe a little bit of a unique perspective. But at Naval War College, I do tend to focus on naval issues, including undersea warfare. I'm very concerned that we are headed, if not already in, a kind of new Cold War with both Russia and China. If I had to give my ideas a bumper sticker besides meeting China halfway, I would say that we should avoid trivia, as George Marshall told Kennan before he started the policy planning department. Avoiding trivia, meaning we should focus on the really big issues, and that foremost among them is preventing the outbreak of war. Now, if you look at my little list here, I'll be covering quite a few issues, but these are, I see here 5 flashpoints, from India to Taiwan, and I put Taiwan in red, and I would have put Taiwan in flashing red if I knew how, because it really is that dangerous at this very moment. Just though to let you know though what kind of things I'm working on day to day, here's a Russian document I came upon about a year ago, which I found really stunning because it explains how if Russia were to allow China to deploy Chinese submarines into its Arctic ports, that would be a huge strategic great leap forward for China's submarine force. So, the fact that Russian strategists are discussing this is profoundly concerning. And it maybe shows you the direction of where world politics is going. It's very troubling indeed. I'm working on a book now on Russia-China relations, so you'll forgive me if that's kind of my current preoccupation. But tonight I'm going to speak more about a book I wrote a few years ago, and this was on U.S.-China relations. Now, it's been since I wrote that book, it came out in 2015, the book called Meeting China Halfway, really, how to put it, the relationship has gone in exactly the opposite direction that I would have hoped. That is, we have more and more tension. Here you see Sean Spicer when he started talking about the South China Sea immediately after the Trump administration took over. Then China very quickly started to parade these massive new missile launchers, DF-41 here, and I began to see things I'd never seen before in Chinese military publications, such as this map of a nuclear impact point on the United States. Very troubling indeed. And, I heard somebody characterize the Trump administration policy toward China recently as something like sledgehammer type policy. Well, we might say that these policies have been mostly designed by the chief advisors on China that President Trump has had. Michael Pillsbury, Peter Navarro, you may want to look these people up. You can see their books here. They are people I've met in the course of my, as growing up among sinologists and so forth, but I do think that we have to question the direction that the relationship has gone as a result of this kind of sledgehammer approach. And, I will say, even really highly respected members of the sinology community, Min Shin Pei, for example, who I remember studying in very carefully his work in graduate school, but he, seems to admire very much this approach by the Trump administration, which is not afraid to push back against China. And many Americans indeed have applauded that aspect of the Trump administration foreign policy. Now, I must tell you, though, and here you see, I'm not going to show a video clip, but you'll see that's Anthony Blinken. He's slated to be one of Biden's top foreign policy advisors. But, I can detect already, though, among Biden's chief advisors, a rather hardline approach, I would say. Not just Tony Blinken, but here you see, you might look at this foreign affairs article by Michelle Flournoy, that everybody's picking her to be the next Secretary of Defense. But here she says that, in her mind, the main problem is the erosion of American deterrence, meaning in her mind, it's all about how do we have the proper capabilities to make sure that, we sort of keep China in the box that it's in. And to me, I think that's a very, let's say that's not the most constructive way to look at U.S.-China relations. And here you see another major advisor to the president-elect. Here you see Eli Ratner. Again, it's quite a hard line type position. And so I guess what I'm saying is I don't see a lot of change coming in the next administration. Hopefully there'll be some change in a progressive direction. But I'm concerned that a lot of the approach that was started in the last few years is going to continue. And the tension likely will continue, including on the military security side, which I'm most concerned with. Now, just as Washington has its many hawks, so they have proliferated in Beijing. And here you can see that when I watch Chinese TV at night, I see some pretty, hawkish viewpoints. It's true, I do tend to watch the military channel in China, that's Channel 7. So here you see a critique saying these moves by the US on Taiwan have been 非常危险的. So as you can see, there's kind of red light blinking from the Chinese point of view as well. And here's another statement, again, suggests that very strong statement by the Chinese military saying, we have the capability and will not tolerate sort of foreign interference. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is Washington has its hawks and the same is true in Beijing. I just picked up these images actually watching last night because there's a major new exhibit on the Korean War. I have a lot of interest in the Korean War, but apparently China's leadership does as well. And I'll tell you, they've been giving a huge amount of coverage. There's a brand new exhibit in Beijing. I guess that's getting a lot of, pulling in a lot of crowds. But, it seems to me it's very disturbing, this kind of, not that they shouldn't memorialize the war, and we'll do the same. By the way, I want to wish all our veterans out there who are listening a happy Veterans Day. But the point is, in a way, the way they're memorializing the Korean War, it seems to be kind of, as it were, a kind of motivational discussion about that China back in the day dared to fight against the United States. And as you can see from this speech, which was, I think, summarized very well in the New York Times on the 23rd of October. And please look up the article yourself and read it carefully, because it really does reveal a kind of thinking about the meaning of the Korean War and what it means for China today. And it's quite disturbing, as I said, when you look at the details here, as you can see, that China might dare, regardless of the cost, as you can see. Okay, so this to me, you have a climate both in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing that is almost starting to feel like a kind of sense of inevitability of this kind of Thucydides trap type conflict. Now, as Mr. Dalio said, though, in effect, he said, what matters is relative capabilities. And here, of course, back in the days of the Korean War, China was very weak, and America really was at its apogee of strength after World War II. And so today, the situation is extremely different now. We have really two militaries that are facing off in the Western Pacific that are, kind of approaching a sort of parity, I think we can say. That is, the U.S. remains stronger in certain things, well, China has a lot of strength in other things. And I could show you plenty of pictures of ships, and I'll show you a few, but this, just very simply, this new cruiser has a lot of people where I work talking, and we just finished a report on it, very impressed with it. But probably the things you don't hear about in the headlines so much, these missiles, for example, and only China has this capability, a capability to launch ballistic missiles against ships at sea. It's a totally new kind of capability. Some have even said that this capability makes even any kind of naval surface ship obsolete. Can you imagine that? It's something we have to consider. We don't know what warfare in the 21st century looks like, but China has a certain vision of it. It's taking it very seriously. And if that wasn't enough, those other types of missiles, here's another kind of missile, which China revealed recently. This is a hypersonic missile, something that the United States, Russia actually has deployed a hypersonic weapon, but the United States has yet to deploy such a weapon. But again, this is thought to be capable of striking ships at sea and very hard to defend against. So these are the kind of thing that keeps military strategists up at night at this point. But China's wielding all kinds of new military capabilities. And I'm sorry to, again, I don't want to give anybody nightmares, but, this part of my job is to keep an eye on this stuff. But We see a lot of interest in, for example, airborne forces. And the truth is, not many militaries still cultivate this kind of capability. China seems to be extremely serious about it, though. I mean, if thinking about it, dropping people out of airplanes at night, dropping vehicles out of airplanes, okay, this is only done by a military that's quite intent on developing very serious capability here. Another new dimension of China's military power concerns helicopters. And really about 10 or 15 years ago, we would have said China's helicopter fleet was laughable, but we don't say that anymore. And really, they're making giant strides here. And this is changing the balance in the Western Pacific, including across the Taiwan Strait. And I'll talk to Taiwan shortly, but also the development of special forces, okay? And since 2001, the United States has also put a premium on special forces, but China has been relentlessly developing these capabilities, including snipers, divers, and the like. And of course, that gives them abilities to strike quickly and in a stealthy way. Now, I do focus mostly on the submarine force, and here there have been quite dramatic improvements in China's submarine force that I've been tracking over a period. But we may say the United States continues to have an advantage here, but it's clear to me that China is watching very much where we go with our submarine force, and also developing capabilities like this anti-submarine aircraft they're working on. It shows a very serious ambition on China's part to build a first-class Navy, and one probably on par with the United States. Now, if you are curious about the military balance, I urge you to look at this piece by Rand that came out in 2015. But I will tell you this, I think this report still underrates China's military power. And I'm somebody who thinks that probably in general, Westerners seem inclined to downplay China's military capabilities. But had I more time, I would explain to you all the nuances here. But I think this, you know, more or less, we're generally underestimating China's military power. Actually, I've written this up in China Quarterly. You can look at this article if you're a scholarly article with all the footnotes and so forth, where I go through my assessment, which I guess from an American point of view is quite a bit more pessimistic than most of those assessments out there. And in a nutshell, folks, and I want to move away from the military nuts and bolts, and talk, you know, more larger strategy issues. But really, the key to understanding this whole situation is to understand the distances, and geography, if you will, is trumps. It is the main factor. That is, two countries that are more or less roughly equivalent in military power. If the battle is fought off of China's shores, then it's very hard for the United States to bring equivalent forces and firepower against that. So China has this distinct geographic advantage within its own proximate regions that we just have to respect. Okay, now, so I've shared a lot of pessimism, but occasionally I am feeling optimistic. This article is a little bit old, but it gives you just a taste, I think, that's important of Chinese viewpoints of this, that some, you know, I said there are a lot of hawks in Beijing, but there are also a lot of doves, a lot of people who are, you know, striving for peace, who see a peaceful future, who want to continue China's peaceful rise. And here's one of them. In fact, interestingly, he mentions Terla Fravel's work, which shows that China generally has not opted to use force and has peacefully settled a lot of its disputes. And indeed, you know, I think if we put in the balance, and I'll give you a kind of, as it were, a plus minus on China's foreign policy, but I think there are a lot of pluses here that are often neglected by the press. You know, here you can see a lot of them, but I've looked, for example, at the Ebola crisis. And well before COVID-19, we had Ebola, and China acted in a very positive way, and really on par with the United States, actually. So, you know, we have to give them some credit occasionally for doing some good out there in the world. And this, I think, we should recognize and encourage. And really, what I tried to do with my 2015 book here was to develop what I call cooperation spirals. And, you know, these cooperation spirals, I mean, it's really rather intuitive. I think even in interpersonal relations, you have a similar phenomena. But the idea is how do we, you can't necessarily leap into a grand bargain with China. I think you want these kind of gradual steps to build trust based on reciprocity, fairness, enforceability. You know, social scientists have shown, through social psychology, that this is essential for building trust. You have to iterate through small steps if you want to build cooperation. So I think there is a social science basis for this. Now, let me address, as it were, the 4 or 5 biggest flashpoints. And one of them, I think we have to say, involves India, right after the summer's clash high up in the Himalayas. There's also been tensions at sea, though, and China is quite concerned with India's Navy. And the United States is involved with exercises with the Indian Navy. So it's something that we have to, that the United States is engaged in. So, I'll just throw out a couple of suggestions here. I won't walk you through all the spirals. We just don't have time. But I just to give you a taste of what kind of ideas that I'm advocating here for a kind of compromise. So in this spiral, you will see that, one of the things I'm interested in, how the U.S. can alter the relationship between China and India. And one way is, I think, if we continue to reduce our military footprint in Central Asia, which at one time, by the way, was quite large. We had bases in Kyrgyzstan also, and in Uzbekistan. We've been reducing those. I think we should be leaving Afghanistan. That will be well received in China, and I think China probably does have a role, maybe a bigger role in the United States in the future of Afghanistan. It's not a bad thing. That's in our interest. And one of our joint interests with China, we have common interests, is that we should support Pakistan. And this could involve even a Chinese pledge not to build military bases in Pakistan. That would help to stabilize what is really a rather volatile relationship. In this book, though, I have a whole chapter on the China-India-US triangle. So I think that's going to be really essential for this coming century. Now, the Japan-US-China triangle is also essential. And here, the history looms large. I would urge anybody who hasn't seen this movie, it's not a Chinese movie, it's not an American movie, it's a German movie, actually, about a German. So if you don't know who John Rabe is, please take a look at this film. But the history is important to address. There are many issues in Japan-China relations to address, and we're hoping for better times. But to me, this relationship is not hardwired for conflict. I think we can help China and Japan to move beyond the history. And one way would be some practical steps that I advocate. For example, and by the way, a lot of my, some of my suggestions are directed toward Americans and others at Chinese, right? And here, for example, China accepting the median line in the East China Sea would be a powerful signal that they were ready to compromise, and we could urge Japan to accept joint administration of the Senkaku Dalio. To me, and I know many Japan specialists just fell out of their chair, but to me, it's going to take these kind of steps if we want to see positive movement in these crucial relationships. But I do think in the long term that it is possible that China and Japan could get along well. They have a lot of common interests, actually. Okay, moving along to the South China Sea. I know the South China Sea has taken, whoops, excuse me, got ahead of myself, but the South China Sea has taken up lots of newsprint in the last 10 years. I have been very clear with my position that the United States should not get involved in a war over rocks and reefs. I maintain that position, even though it's true China in the meantime has built up its reef bases considerably. And here you see an illustration of what those kind of reef bases might, the way China imagines them. And I sure as a Navy person don't like to see this carrier burning in the center, which is obviously a illustration of the kind of tensions that we're having. So we need to put a lid on these tensions, in my view. And while I don't think this is as dangerous as the Taiwan issue, I do think we have to be cautious here. And some of the ideas that I've been pushing in the South China Sea include the imperative for China to undertake substantive joint development. Gongtong Kaifa, as I said, that is what China has said its actual policy is in the South China Sea, and we should hold them to it. And by the way, there's good news on this front recently is that the Philippines and China have actually taken some concrete steps toward joint development recently. And to me, that is really the only solution to this very complex problem. I'm happy to talk about other steps here, but I'm moving towards some other issues as well here. And North Korea has been on all of our minds, really. I traveled to the North Korean border, actually, the China and North Korean border twice in the last couple of years. Here's you can see in the lower left-hand corner is a picture I snapped on what is supposed to be the 最美丽的高铁. So this was maybe the most beautiful of all the high-speed rails in China that's built right down to the North Korean border. Pretty amazing ride. But I have put forward some proposals, and you can see my article from North Korea Review that I wrote a couple of years back, where I tried to suggest that we actually have to support, instead of trying to build antagonism within the China-North Korea relationship, we should be doing the opposite. We want to strengthen that relationship, and that might enable denuclearization, or at least a freeze. And indeed, we have seen a freeze, partly thanks to China's good work here. So to me, that's important. We should recognize that. Now, as far as, steps that could be taken here, one of the things I talked about was China proposing a 4-power Yellow Sea patrol. The Yellow Sea has all kinds of issues with mines and, sea mines, and also a lot of fisheries issues. And so I could see a lot of reasons why we may want to undertake this 4-power patrol that would obviously include South Korea. That's critical. Now you will see, some discussion of some withdrawal of U.S. personnel from South Korea. I'm in favor of some modest withdrawals, particularly on a symbolic level, to pull North Korea into kind of a cycle of cooperation that involves some steps toward disarmament. So that's we could do a whole lecture on the North Korea issue. I've thought about it a lot, but it is critical to peace in East Asia for sure. Now, Taiwan, and let me check the time here because I don't want to overstay my welcome. And you all are staying up late for me. I'm very honored. But Taiwan is, to me, is the most dangerous place in the world, bar none. And I think, but more dangerous than the Korean Peninsula, more dangerous than the Kashmir. We have to consider the fact that this could lead to, even to a World War type situation between the U.S. and China. It's sort of made for Hollywood, if you will, but we need to take this situation very seriously, and I fear that we're too dismissive of it and just kind of hope things blow over. A lot of American strategists, I think, basically assume that China is bluffing, and that's very dangerous, to my estimate. At the same time, I think many Chinese assume the U.S. is bluffing. Well, folks, that is how you sleepwalk into a conflict, when both sides kind of assume the other is bluffing, and neither are willing to take steps toward compromise. So to me, this situation has become much more complicated and much more tense, partly because of the Hong Kong protests. And I'm sure the people in Hong Kong would have no idea that they were having these kind of second order effects. But, this, as you can see in the center of my screen here, center of your screen, it says that one country, two systems is dead. This suggests that the pathway that Deng Xiaoping had developed for a kind of peaceful unification, that may be dead, and that has a lot of Chinese concern that Taiwan will split forever, and they find that unacceptable, which now raises the possibility of kind of real conflict here. So what am I proposing here? Well, to me, there does have to be some kind of change of course. To my estimate, the U.S. has tried to kind of pull Taiwan closer and closer, looking at the military balance. I'm very disturbed by it, hoping deterrence would carry the day. I don't think it's possible, honestly. I don't think that defense of Taiwan is feasible, either from Taiwan's point of view or from the U.S. point of view. So, that may be shocking to some people, but that is my reading of the military situation. And the political situation has to be linked to the military situation. So I'm advocating for, certain steps toward compromise. And that would mean a gradual shut off of the arms supply pipeline, starting with closing the military office in the American Institute of Taiwan. That's essentially the US embassy there. And I think China might reciprocate by pulling missiles back. So we can talk about the different steps here, but in my view, there has to be some kind of de-escalation here, because what I see is the opposite, is just continuous escalation. And I could walk you through the steps that I've seen in the last year, but it's exactly the opposite of what I would recommend. So again, we really, we need to, let's put it this way. If you had asked me 10 years ago, what's the probability of a US-China war over Taiwan, I would have said it's probably 1 to 2%, maybe lower. Today, it's as high as 15 to 20%. That is way too high, folks. We're gambling with our future, and the future for our children, the future of the planet, really, is in the balance. So we can't accept that. Well, let me just close up with a couple more slides here. We won't go through all of this, but I just want to, we can try to put, if you will, Chinese foreign policy, and evaluate it in terms of, what's good and what's bad, if you will. It's kind of a simple way to do it, but we're really disturbed by the rapid military modernization. The repression of minorities and so forth. There are things to be worried about, absolutely. And yet, we have to take a balanced view and see that China has not resorted to force in almost 40 years. That's really incredible, actually, if you think about it. So to me, if you take a balanced view, we can be more positive about world order as it's developing, as China rises. Now, I haven't mentioned climate change. I do have a chapter in my book, though. To my estimate, that is really the biggest issue. That is the issue we should be focused on. I hope the Biden administration will put that back in its priority place. It is the most important issue facing the world. And I do think under the Obama administration, actually, it was given that pride of place. And huge achievements were made during that time in terms of sort of, how to put it, pulling China along. And China has made a new commitment. So I think, the next step really is to bring India along and some of the others as well. But China has a long way to go too. And I think they have been backsliding a little bit because of US-China tension. So we could talk about that. But to me, all these crisis issues and the militarized rivalry take us away from what is really the biggest threat to the planet, other than, some kind of nuclear war. Okay, well, since I wrote the book, just a couple of parting shots here as I've thought more about the evolution of world order. And I tell you, I, for a long time, was a big UN skeptic. I thought it was more or less worthless talk shop, didn't do much. And when they did send troops, they seemed to make a muck of it. I've really changed my view, though, just reflecting more on how world order is developing. I do think that we have to re-examine the United Nations. After all, Roosevelt was no dummy. He knew a thing or two about both China and Russia, and he, could look and survey. That's my alarm telling me to wind it up. But to me, the 5 policeman model is not such a bad one. We shouldn't be in a hurry to discard it. I think we might want to come back to this. After all, look at these pictures. For example, here you see this is in Lebanon, okay, and you see Chinese troops are coaching people through a demining exercise. Well, think about that. That's pretty amazing. Here's Chinese peacekeepers in South Sudan, both pretty dangerous places, right? Now, by the way, there are hardly any Americans under blue helmets. But to me, if you want to kind of, as it were, hope for a future of cooperation and one in which China is kind of, as it were, a responsible stakeholder, then this to me seems like exactly the route we should think about, where Roosevelt wanted us to go and consider it. After all, he was used to dealing with pretty gnarly characters like Joseph Stalin here, right? But he did it because he knew he had to. That's kind of being a realist. And part of that is embracing multipolarity there. And I know there's a whole, many international relations experts who reject multipolarity out of hand. They think it's, inherently unstable and so forth. But I think, we have no choice but to try to look for the upsides, look for the silver lining. I think I'm going in reverse order here, but let's rediscover the Treaty of Westphalia. What did that say in a nutshell? I think people are rolling their eyes saying it's late, Lyle, to start talking about Westphalia. But there was a key moment at the Treaty of Westphalia where they, really settled something very profound for European history. And the idea was because Germany had been riven by this terrible war for 30 years, where it was totally destroyed because they couldn't make up their mind whether they should be Catholics or Protestants. But in this treaty, they codified that every country should choose its own, system of cultural and its own style of governance. And really, we need to rediscover that and allow countries to have their own path. I think that's absolutely critical. And that should allow us the kind of nation building at home that we are really much in need of. And again, if you're saying to yourself, why are we talking about all this military stuff? We should be talking about the pandemic and climate change. I absolutely agree. And what I'm trying to do is, take these pots that are boiling off, turn down the heat. Let's start to build a more cooperative environment where we can focus on the pandemic and climate change, because those are really the main threats. And the other threats really are just in our heads, to be honest. Okay, and one last parting shot here is, just as I look through the evidence here, I'm very disturbed to see things like this, where here's a strategy for China's layout in the Atlantic. And it says that, the South China Sea has become more prominent to contain China's rise, but they can return the favor by putting pressure on the U.S. in the Atlantic, folks, to give us misgivings about pushing China around in its backyard. So to me, this really is exactly what we don't want. It's the full flowering of a kind of Cold War that takes over the entire planet, and maybe more destructive and dangerous than the first Cold War. So this is what we need to avoid. But thanks very much, folks, for hearing me out, and we are very eager to hear your questions and your comments, and like to hear your ideas about how to try to bring this dangerous relationship into a better place. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing so I can see people too.
Thank you, Professor Goldstein. I think the earlier national town hall is more philosophical. Yours is more with sound and fury. You really have brought the audience, from somewhere in the midair, to the ground. Summer and Wendy, they're going through chat to identify questions and pose questions to you. So I will just pose the first question to you. Your book, Meeting China Halfway, came out 5 years ago. So in these 5 years, in terms of, I think, almost 100 recommendations to both sides, to come into the middle, are there anyone that getting close to become a policy, either on China's side or on the US side? And secondary to that is, have you been criticized? Because you work in Naval War College. Are there people from the military saying, this professor is too pacifist? He's too soft on China. That have you ever encountered that criticism? If you could share that with the audience, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Yawei. Yeah, those are two challenging questions, I would say. I'm counting on you to fire some softballs here. No, just kidding there. Well, I'll take the second one first. It is a bit of a tricky situation. I mean, I'm a professor who has the interesting job of working in a government institution. And now, of course, when I signed up to work at Naval War College, I knew very well that the Navy was going to play a critical role in the U.S.-China relationship. So, I'm very proud to work for the Navy and at Naval War College. I think they have supported me, and it really is a wonderful place to work. And the good news is I really have never felt in a major way that been pressured to kind of take a certain viewpoint. That said, though, yes, I am in in a bit of a battle. I would say there has been a kind of major change of assessment among the faculty toward a much more pessimistic view. We can talk about many of the reasons for that. And by the way, I certainly do agree that China has as it were, also played a role in fostering a lot of these tensions. Both sides have been pushing the envelope, as it were, on the escalation ladder. No question, China's fortifications in the South China Sea has raised a lot of hackles. I tell people when they look at the South China Sea, I say, imagine the Caribbean. That is really how China views the South China Sea. It's not to say that, in the same way we don't own the Caribbean, and yet in some ways we do own the Caribbean, and many American naval strategists, certainly 100 years ago, when they thought a lot about the Caribbean, would have said, yes, we need to control the Caribbean. The Monroe Doctrine is sort of premised on the idea that no other power would be permitted to have any kind of serious power. So it's fair to say, Yawei, that I am fighting the tide, as it were. But I think, my colleagues do seem to value hearing a kind of different perspective. And I do hope very much that the Biden administration will maintain the ability of all researchers, but including government researchers, to get to China frequently. Certainly that's helped to, my understanding of different perspectives. As far as have any of my ideas really come to fruition? Well, I guess I'm sad to say that it's really, like I said, gone in the opposite direction, with tensions blossoming unfortunately more and more, and that's been unfortunate. But
get too many passes this time.
On the like I said, a couple of things have kind of fortuitously come true, though. Central Asia, for example, has seen a natural kind of decrease, as it were, in the U.S. presence there that has, I think, probably could enable a more constructive approach. And I think the U.S. essentially should leave Central Asia and allow the other powers to take the lead. It is part of multipolarity. That's kind of a logical outcome. I also mentioned, you may recall, in the South China Sea, that the Philippines and China, a lot of Americans very disturbed by the way the Philippines has gone, and certainly there are disturbing elements of it, but the Philippines pulling a little closer to China, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think possibly they could come to a compromise that the United States could live with, and we could decrease tensions in the South China Sea in that way. So that, there are some hopeful developments out there. It's not all escalation, although a lot of it is. Okay. Other questions, though? Do you want to feed me the questions, Yawei?
No, Wendy.
I can read them.
Okay, great.
I just want to echo Yawei's sentiments. Thank you so much, Professor Goldstein, for sharing your insights. I feel like I learned so much, and I'm sure others feel the same. The next question is from Leo. He said, China most likely won't be firing the first shot. What would happen if other regional players fire the first shot and situations quickly escalate to a point of U.S. determining its involvement imminent?
Yeah, thank you, Leo. I think I recall a meeting not so long ago, and it's nice to have you here. I think that you're probably right that China's approach is that they will not fire the first shot. And think about that. I hope everybody will reflect on that for a minute, because I do see that in Chinese military publications, almost like a doctrinal principle that China will not fire the first shot. So that's profoundly good. And it shows that they understand restraint. And, a lot of people have been disturbed, for example, by Chinese use of Coast Guard forces in the South China Sea. They use their water cannons, and they'll often pull the boats up and maybe even ram the other boats. And so, certainly not safe seamanship by any stretch of the imagination. On the other hand, I often say, what would you prefer, that the Chinese Navy came in and started shooting? No, I don't think you prefer that either. So, I mean, in some respect, I think it's fair to say that if China wants to have a Coast Guard that kind of pushes people around, well, so be it. To me, that's not a big danger to U.S. national interest. It's certainly better than a than a Chinese Navy that's going on some kind of rampage and destroying ships here and there. Now, there is an exception, and you're probably aware of that. And I believe a professor, a very wise Chinese strategist who I know at Fudan University published a piece about a month ago, a very disturbing piece in the Global Times, where he actually said, well, we won't fire first except, and he made the argument that China needs to realize that a great power sometimes does need to fire first. Now, is that argument persuasive? Well, I hope not, of course, but I think many in China will say yes, on the Taiwan issue in particular, China may fire first. And in that case, of course, we may be in a shooting war. My position on Taiwan, though, is quite clear. And this is not a popular position. I'm not going to run for office with this position, but I will say it nonetheless, because I think this is a civil war that has continued into the present, and that the United States should not defend Taiwan. I think Taiwan needs to enter negotiations and move toward a settlement. The current situation is not sustainable, and the United States, even if it wanted to defend Taiwan, I don't believe it's actually feasible from a military point of view, which is kind of important, right? If you're going to try to form an alliance, or some people are talking about it kind of reinvigorating an alliance that was actually abrogated in the late 70s under Carter, actually. So I don't think that is in the U.S. interest at all. And there was Carter was very wise to abrogate that treaty. And, people today need to reflect on the wisdom of a whole lot of diplomats going back through the years, all the way back to Kissinger, who put this relationship on a positive trajectory. And it takes a lot of Americans, scholars, diplomats, the public to guard U.S.-China relations against these kind of waves that come at it. But I could tell you, I do not think it's in the U.S. national interest to go to war over Taiwan. Let me be quite emphatic on that point. Next question.
Thank you so much. That was very thorough. The next question, they were wondering if you have any predictions for China policies under the Biden administration, particularly with regards to trade, education, and health collaboration.
Well, there I'm quite optimistic. To me, I think I have seen a variety of positive signals. If one looks to the Obama administration, for example, like I said, to me, they did put the right things first. They did put climate change at the top of the agenda, and he was willing to put other things aside to make time for that and really push China on climate change. And I think real progress was made. So I think in the areas that were just mentioned, education and healthcare, the Democrats have tended to be more constructive in the sense of saying, hey, we're going to agree to disagree on certain issues, but we're going to, on certain other issues, there's a lot of space for cooperation. And to me, that is a more mature approach. I would like to see them go even further. I think, unfortunately, many on that side of the spectrum have also they tend to say, well, let's cooperate on clean energy and education, all those issues, and we'll just, put off the hard issues for another time. Well, we all know, that, even issues like North Korea and things like that, we wish they would just sort of disappear somehow. They're not disappearing, they're still with us, even decades later. And sometimes they get more and more dangerous. So to me, I would like to see leaders bravely take up these hard issues instead of kicking the can constantly down the road. That to me is, somewhat irresponsible, right? We don't want do you want your children to be getting ready for war over Taiwan, or would you like to actually make some hard decisions today that enable a peaceful settlement of the issue? I think we can do that.
Wendy, you want to bring the next question?
Sorry, I don't have the questions. There's a power outage, so I think Summer has the rest.
Yeah, I got them. So in regards to Taiwan, actually, Someone was wondering, how do you get both sides to know that the other side is not bluffing?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. Well, part of it is, you know, the sad thing about international politics that I've observed over quite a long time of looking at it is, and through my reading of history, is that people rarely know themselves if they're bluffing. I mean, if you asked any members of Congress or leaders, you know, ask them a tough question, say, are you ready to, how many American lives are you willing to lose over Taiwan? Oh, they'll kind of laugh at you and say, we're not, it's never going to come to that. And we you know, don't really want to think about that. And yet the same person will advocate for a kind of escalation measures, escalating the conflict more. So to me, that's kind of a cop-out. And I think that we ourselves ought to be extremely clear about it and say, you know, what are you willing to go to war for? It's very important. And, you know, I think in a way, China has done that. They have said, you know, a certain category of issues are what they call core interests. And the definition of a core interest is what the country is willing to go to war for. By the way, some American strategists have kind of adopted this similar discourse, which is interesting in itself. You know, maybe we're learning from Chinese strategists, but what I'm saying is, you know, Americans, first of all, I don't think many of them could find Taiwan on a map if they had to, which should tell you something, nor have they really thought over what it would look like if their country fell into a war with China. So I'm very disturbed by that. I mean, to me, that's kind of the definition of what could be called sleepwalking. You know, you don't want to sleepwalk into a war. That would be the really foolhardy and, you know, likely disastrous. So a much smarter approach is to think these issues through ahead of time, and I think that can be done. And I think we can design a defensive strategy that does, you know, take account of, we don't know what China's will be like in the future. And, you know, there is a small probability that China could emerge as kind of an aggressive nationalist state that really threw its weight around. I don't think it's likely, but it is possible. Okay, I admit that. Well, what to do then? I think, you know, we can have a defensive strategy, one that preserves our alliances, say, with Japan and Philippines, but it's a defensive one. It says, we're not going to defend every rock and reef, but we are, if China were to attack, you know, the main island of Luzon or Okinawa or something like that, of course, the U.S. would be involved. And I support that. So to me, it's a matter of drawing a realistic red line. But we as Americans have to do that. And I encourage the young people here that are listening that as much as you don't want to think about these things, you really must think about them some and think about what is worth major risks. And the reason I say that partly is because it's not just the risk of war. There is a risk of war. Hopefully it is not very high. I put it at about 15%. To me, that's way too high. But it's worse than that, folks, because your billions, hundreds of billions of your taxpayer money is going toward feeding this rivalry when it should be going toward, you know, a better health system and a better education system and a better environment and things like that. So, you know, I could say that as a member of, you know, somebody who gets a paycheck from Defense Department. I need to tell you that this money could be spent in better ways. Okay, hopefully I'm not talking myself out of a job, but really, this is a profound misuse of resources, and we need to improve our relations with China, frankly, with Russia as well, and we need to radically decrease, I would say, the amount of resources put toward militarized rivalry, put it toward other things. By the way, the pandemic response, one reason it's been weak is because we have not put adequate resources toward this.
So Lyle, we have a professor at Jilin University. He is extending an invitation to you to visit his university. You know, Jilin obviously is just right across from North Korea. And I think he just recently traveled to North Korea. So Dr. Wang, you'd like to say something to Professor Goldstein?
Yes, thank you. Okay, yes. Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay, my name is Wang Li. I'm teaching at the Jilin University. And I returned back to Dandong last 2 weeks ago for the anniversary of I gave the comments on the Korean War. Of course, now in China, we don't call the Korean War, we call the resist American aggression and aid the Korean people. The Korean War is a civil war between the two Koreas. That is not the business of China. That is the official definition. Very interesting. But you're welcome to China, to Jilin, and I will be your tour guide and bodyguide to Dandong first. Second, regarding Taiwan, I fully agree with you that the issue of Taiwan is closely related to the ruling party, because Taiwan was conceded to the run away by the defeating of China 100 years ago, and also many Chinese believe that the Chinese Communist Party missed the opportunity to reunify China because of the Korean War. So now I don't think the Chinese government and the leaders will miss any opportunity, will give any chance to let Taiwan independent. That is a very dangerous game. So if you can tell the people outside on the both sides of the Chinese is better. Thank you very much. Okay, my question is that regarding South China Sea, Chinese government has repeatedly said the South China Sea is the common property of the region. That is a huge retreat or change from the sovereignty to the current situation. However, I have seldom read any scholars, maybe that is my fault, okay? Not many people talk about the China has repeated that the South China Sea is not part of China anymore. China say some part of South China Sea belong to China, but China has not said over the past year or years. I don't remember. I can double check. China hasn't claimed that the whole region of South China Sea belong to China. No, I don't think so. And also publicly, officially say that South China Sea is the common property of the region. So what do you think about that? Do you think China has already morally psychologically recognize that we don't claim the whole region, but we want to make a more peaceful coexistence? Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
maybe,
yes. Yes, I hear you. 非常感谢你说的话. You said that very clearly, and your English is very good. I wish my Chinese was so good. So I would like to visit you very much, and I have been to Dandong and Jilin, and I like 我是东北人，是的. I like the Chinese Northeast. It's I'm also a Northeasterner, so. Professor Wang, I think you make good comments, and I think your argument is very interesting, that China's South China Sea position is evolving, and I think I agree with you. I'm not following it super closely right now, but I agree that there seems to be some movement and some acceptance by China that it needs to compromise on the hard issues, and I think, I might even dare say that China feels stronger. It has, its forces are arrayed, it has all these bases, and that maybe also allows it to make compromise because it doesn't fear, it doesn't fear making a compromise. Sometimes it's easier to compromise when you're strong. And so I think China realizes that if it pushes Philippines too much, if it pushes Vietnam too much, then that will create long-term problems. And that's a more kind of enlightened view. And I think China is slowly coming around to that viewpoint. So I think I would agree with you on that, Professor.
So there are more questions, but I think we need to wrap this up. So I will get the last few questions all together to you, and hopefully you'll be able, you have the last say. So one question is how China, Russia relationship is impacting the US-China relationship. Question number 2 is it's an interesting question, saying hypothetically, if there is a succession problem in the US, will China take the advantage of a leadership vacuum and initiate attack on Taiwan to try to unify with Taiwan? Last question is what you said in your presentation, the return to the Treaty of Westphalia, that each nation is entitled to choose its own political path. To what extent you think the leadership, the elite in the US will accept that? I think that China very welcomes that. And Xi Jinping and others in their speeches, they oftentimes talk about, each nation is entitled to their own political path. And President Carter, in his op-ed in Washington Post, said how China is governing itself and how Chinese people choose their leaders, that's the Chinese business. That's not American business. So I think that's a key for the two relationship, to peacefully coexist, that the two sides probably need to accept each other and particularly to see some value in the other side political system. So to what extent do you think that is going to be received? So no questions, but I noticed there are quite a few ghostings in the audience. Maybe your parents, your relatives. So on behalf of all the audience, I want to extend our thanks, for Lyle to give us this brilliant presentation, and thank you for joining us to enjoy this presentation at this very critical moment. So Lyle, you have the last thing.
Okay, sure, Yawei. Yeah, I'll try to make it quick so people can get off to bed. It's so kind of you again to have me, and I appreciate people even all the way from China, but people, friends around the country and overseas are listening. That's great. Well, let me just make a quick comment on China-Russia relations. It is, I am working on a book. It should be out. We'll send it in next year. And I'll tell you, our take is that Russia-China relations are very strong. Putin said as much recently at the famous Valdai conference. And to me, some Westerners have kind of made the claim that the relationship is brittle. I disagree with that. I think it has really fundamental strength if you look around at all the dimensions, and they're real, not simply national interests, not simply a common interest in opposing the United States in many circumstances, but also just very practical interests. I mean, they just put two bridges, big bridges, over the Amur River. I mean, it's unbelievable that it's taken so long, but that is a major development for Russia-China relations, and frankly, it's a welcome success for everyone. And I think even if enlightened Americans will see that they don't have an interest in fostering tension between Russia and China. We're actually all better off, actually, in the world if Russia and China get along. Now, that said, I don't think we want to see Russia and China go into a militarized alliance against the United States. I think that would be a dangerous development. But I think people in Beijing and Moscow understand that generally, and they are kind of avoiding this step because they know that would be destabilizing. So I think wise American leadership, enlightened leadership will understand that and move ahead cautiously. We won't pursue a NATO in East Asia. That would be destabilizing. And that would almost surely prompt Russia and China to go into an alliance, a formalized alliance that was against the United States. So I think, I'm hoping both sides will step back from the brink. Now, interesting question about whether China might take advantage of succession difficulties in Washington. I would prefer not even to speculate on that. That to me is very troubling possibility on all counts. But I guess I would caution that people have underestimated the United States before, so we wouldn't want to make that mistake. But it is a concern. We're all wondering. And by the way, I would say to all my friends from Georgia out there it's been a very interesting week, thanks in part to Georgia. So very interesting, folks. Now, on the last question regarding Westphalia, though, and wood, you know, I think, yes, in a way, this is a more Chinese viewpoint. It's kind of live and let live. China wants to live a certain way, and Xi Jinping wants China to live in a certain way. Can we live and let live? To me, we can do that. I don't think that's so far from the American approach. We haven't had that viewpoint in a long time, but in a multipolar world where different kinds of countries coexist, and where we try to have a decent relationship with a lot of countries that are different from ourselves, I think Americans need to relearn how to do this. So that's why I'd like to hope that American elites can rediscover Westphalia and the virtues of live and let live. To me, there could be a lot of benefits. By the way, I'm very skeptical of these claims about influence operations across the board. I've been skeptical from the beginning. I think the evidence has been very thin. And so what I'm saying is I don't think that either China or really, frankly, Russia either have undertaken some of these influence operations. I think that's been exaggerated, vastly exaggerated. And so, you know, to me, both those countries more or less do accept the Westphalian premise that countries should sort of stay out of each other's politics. And we should continue to respect those guardrails that will help us to get along with each other. I think so. We need to kind of study up on that again. We're not the only country, but in my view, that will help us find a way toward peace and getting at some of these incredibly difficult issues like climate change, the pandemic, as well as just preventing any kind of great power war. So let me end on that point. I thank you all. Get to bed, everyone, but thanks so much for coming out, and thanks to the Carter Center for having me. I will really look forward to further collaboration with the Carter Center.
Yeah, we have a very engaged audience, and they certainly have lots of questions, but time is up, so we need to end this. We will post the recording. I hope, Lyle, you're fine with that. If you have issues, let me know, so we won't post it. As you said, we don't want you to be out of a job because of the news that shared with the audience. I think what you said is very beautiful. Live and let live. You know, I hope everyone here will keep in mind that message and also broadcast that message, you know, to the entire community that care about the relationship. I think the two countries, if they work together, they cooperate together, we'll have a much better world, a world of peace and prosperity. Thank you, Lyle. Thank you, the audience, and thank you all. Have a good night and have good morning, good noon in China. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Zaijian.
Thank you guys very much. It was very interesting, Professor. Really appreciated the talk. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, Summer. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks all the audience.
Thanks, Yawei, for chairing this wonderful panel.
Thank you. And we made a mistake, so this won't be repeated. We will be able to have 350 people next time. But you know, we're learning, and sorry about that. All right, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.